All right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Link event, Confronting Iran and the Future of the JCPOA. We've got a great panel tonight. I just want to thank you for taking the time to come tonight. For those of you, how many is this your first Link event that you've been to? All right, so we got the good. So for those of you that are new, Link is the Young Professionals Program for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy that I, Ian Byrne, Media Relations Coordinator, and my colleague Jenny Graves coordinate. LINK is actually a very clever acronym for Learn, Inform, Network, and Know. We're a group of young professionals from across many sectors, whether it's policy, think tank, on the Hill, in government, private sector, nonprofit. Maybe your work has nothing to do with the Middle East or national security, but what brings us all together is a shared interest in the Middle East and foreign policy. Tonight we've got a great panel. I want to introduce a few of my colleagues. First we've got Ambassador James Jeffrey, long-time diplomat. He had postings as U.S. Ambassador to Albania, U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, and also served as U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor to George W. Bush. To Ambassador Jeffrey's right is Jay Solomon, long-time foreign affairs reporter. He's been posted to Asia, the Middle East, and he finished up with the Wall Street Journal as their chief foreign affairs correspondent, and he's the author of Iran Wars. To Jay's right is Ambassador Dennis Ross, who served in the following administrations: Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and the Obama administration, serving in high-level Middle East advisor roles. And finally, we have Karen DeYoung, who is with the Washington Post. She's been there 30 years. She's currently, over 30 years, she's currently the associate editor and senior national security correspondent. And she will be moderating tonight. So Karen, thank you all for joining us tonight, and we look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you.
Oh, sorry, one more bit. Welcome to those of you on the live stream. If all of your phones are turned off, that'd be great. Usually we do these off the record, but we open it up since it's such a high caliber panel tonight. So for those of you joining our live stream, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. And welcome, everybody. I thought I'd start just to set the stage a little bit. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the JCPOA, and you've read every word of it. And how many pages? Many. 155. 155 pages.
But who's counting?
Clear as mud. But in any case, just to bring us up to speed for where we are now, of course, during his presidential campaign, and since he's been president, President Trump has called it the worst deal ever negotiated and said it's something that it's against American interests to perpetuate. And in response to a congressional mandate to report on Iran's compliance with the deal, the president has refused now twice to certify that Iran is keeping its commitments under the deal, despite the fact that senior members of his administration have said that it is complying with the deal, including CIA Director Mike Pompeo in his confirmation testimony today. In January, under separate legislative mandate that comes due every 120 days, the president was required to authorize a continuation of the waiver of sanctions whose withdrawal was part of the deal. If he didn't do that every 120 days, the sanctions would go back into effect. In January, again, President Trump signed the waiver, but said it was the last time he would do it, that unless the agreement was fixed, all deals were off, sanctions would be reimposed, and that would effectively put the United States in violation of the deal, and in effect it would be the end of the deal, at least as far as the United States was concerned. And at the time, the president outlined three things that he said needed to be changed in the deal. They included its sunset provisions, the years in which certain of its provisions ceased to be in effect, and particularly those under which there are restrictions on Iran's uranium enrichment capability. The agreement's failure to include restrictions on the development and testing of intercontinental ballistic missiles, And he also called for toughening of its verification provisions. And he said if those fixes were not made, the United States would be out of the deal. The European allies that are also parties to the deal, Britain, France, and Germany, have said that they share some of his concerns and were willing to work with the United States to address them, but only in ways that would not affect the actual agreement itself. They maintain that the agreement cannot be changed and that they would not subscribe to any attempt to change it. So for the past several months, they have been, the Europeans have been negotiating with the administration. They just had another meeting this week here in Washington, led by the State Department, to come up with some way that will meet President Trump's demands that what he calls the flaws in the agreement are addressed. The deadline for them to come to some kind of agreement is May 12th, because that's the next time the administration has to decide again whether to waive the sanctions. Since January, of course, as we all know, even as those negotiations have been underway, the President's national security team has changed significantly. The Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, both of whom advised keeping the JCPOA in place, have been replaced by two men who have in the past both been outspoken in advocating U.S. withdrawal from the deal. So, bringing us up to that point, I'd like each of you to talk for a few minutes about where you think we are right now and where this is likely to go. Jim, you want to start?
Sure. Even though Karen, I was looking at the list to your left and was hoping that Dennis and Jay would. I'm going to take a slightly different approach and give you 2 bits of background to understand what they're going to tell you. The first thing is I had the honor and charm of being in the Bush White House. And so the first thing to understand about the JCPOA is this was basically, while Bush and the Republicans don't admit it now, it was basically a Bush initiative. And to understand where we are in this thing, it's important to understand why. There was thought in the administration when we found out about Natrans, and then we eventually found out about Fodro, that we had to do something about this. The Europeans have been negotiating, and we decided that we had to become engaged one way or the other. We had 2 choices. If we wanted to get the kind of clean bill of health on a nuclear program that we got with Iraq, we had to do what we did in Iraq, which is invade with a couple of 100,000 troops. In the Bush administration in 2006, 2007, you can understand why that happy course of action was, with one exception I won't mention, but with some thinking you'll figure out who that was dismissed. And so we had to go down a different path. The path we went down was the P5+1, or as the Europeans like to say, the EU 3+3. But for all of us, we're in America here. It's P5+1, okay? And that was basically a creation of the Bush administration. And 4 of the 5 relevant UN Security Council resolutions that formed the core of the UN position, which was very important, the Security Council position, were generated in the Bush administration, all unanimously. I sometimes add, whereas the one in the Obama administration was not unanimous, but as Dennis knows, people might blame me for part of that, as one of the 2 outliers was Turkey, with a whole other story. I'm kind of cautious about that. I'm a little bit sheepish about raising that point. So the point is, we had a choice. We could have gotten no centrifuges, no enrichment, and a forever renunciation of a nuclear program, which is what we think we have with Libya, what we think we have with Iraq. But it comes at a very high price. When you decide you're not going to do that, and you don't have the means yourself through sanctions and diplomatic action to pressure another country, and the Iranians were happy to sell their pistachios and rugs and oil everywhere else in the world, you have to go to the international community, which is what we did. And we got the international community, including the Security Council, which means the Russians and the Chinese, mobilized. We got the European 3 in the Security Council, plus Germany involved, and the EU kicking along. And the end was a compromise agreement that we can pick at, but it kind of is about the best you get. The UN is like the Catholic Church. It believes in redemption, penance, confession, and doing better. So you cannot impose forever a you can't enrich, for example, because enrichment is not prohibited in the NPT, and the UN is a very legalistic structure with everybody being equal, kind of like the U.S. Constitution treats American citizens. So therefore, you have to have due process for everything, and there is no due process that I know of to ban forever Iran's doing something that other countries can do simply because they were bad, naughty, and actually came very close to a full weaponization program up to 2003. It doesn't matter. They just get to, suffer the sanctions for half a decade, and then they sign on to this agreement, and eventually they move back. So in trying to figure out how we're going to fix this or change this, aside from the practical problems you have, some of the logic of why this is the world's worst agreement neglects this history. We couldn't have gotten I don't think, we could have gotten a substantially better agreement going through the international community with Iran, and Iran knew it. Okay, my second point, but it's an important one, is, and I have a training aid here, and that is, but despite what at this institution, Vice President Joe Biden said in 2015 that this was solely a transactional agreement. It was all about centrifuges and lifting sanctions and kind of a deal, a thieves' deal among people who were doing this basically to solve one problem without dealing with the others. There was clearly, I think, in parts of the Obama administration, this idea that we needed a different approach towards the Middle East, and part of that was a different approach towards Iran, and that by doing so we could save ourselves a lot of the conflicts we had gotten in the past. There was a hope that this would be not a transactional but a transformational one. The Europeans, also driven by their usual commercial interests, also felt that way. And the only bit of solid evidence I have is Article 33 of the agreement. Now, again, this was supposedly an agreement where we would lift all of the things we were doing to inflict pain in return for them, basically moving back away, about a year away from having a visible capability that would yield a bomb, one or more bombs, for various periods of time. But stuck in the middle of this thing is E3, EU3, that's us, because they didn't adhere to my P5+1, and Iran will agree on steps to ensure Iran's access in areas of trade, technology, finance, and energy. The EU will further explore possible areas for cooperation between the EU, its member states, and Iran. In this context, consider the use of available instruments such as export credits to facilitate trade, project financing, and investment in Iran. In other words, that's the only specific piece of evidence I can cite. But behind that, I think there is an iceberg below the surface of hopes and beliefs in Europe and to some degree in Washington that this would transform Iran, that we would receive and welcome Iran back into the international community. And once it felt that it was trusted, it could talk to us, it could be, as President Obama used to say, don't you want all the benefits of Silicon Valley? It could start having that because Iran is definitely a technologically pretty sharp country. It would drop all of this crazy Hezbollah, Houthis, all of the H groups, and focus on being a, as we used to say with China, responsible stakeholder in the international community. It didn't work out. A month after this thing was signed, while still under the sanctions that were still in effect, Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force leader, the guy responsible for trying to blow up the Cafe Milano a little bit before, travels to Moscow to cut the deal that got the Russian troops into Syria, and you all know where we are today. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Jay?
Thank you, Karen. I personally think the president probably is going to pull out from the deal next month, though nothing he does is set in stone. But I'm someone who believes that the JCPOA, the agreement, was either going to collapse under its own weight or was going to have to be negotiated before the end of the terms that are now the deal in 10 or 15 years for three reasons. One, that under this agreement, they're allowed to have essentially an industrial scale nuclear capacity in about 15 years. And without this transformation on some level of the regime's tactics, I find it very hard to believe that in 10, 8 years, whenever we start to get close to these deadlines of the deal ending, that the international community was going to accept Iran having this massive ability to enrich uranium and essentially have the time for it to have enough fuel to make an atomic weapon go to a zero. So on that level, I think the issue of the sunsets was going to, without this political change of some sort, the sunset was going to be a real problem relatively soon. I also think the issue of sanctions, I think the Iranians were very clever in the way this deal was structured, because they basically set this narrative that, oh, we've reached this agreement, and because of it, we can't be sanctioned anymore, which was not the narrative the U.S. took. The U.S. was like, well, we're going to lift sanctions related to the nuclear issues, but we have the right to sanction them for terrorism or human rights abuses or other issues. But I don't think there was ever really a consensus on what that really meant, particularly amongst the Europeans and the United States. And I think when President Obama was in power, that was fine because they wanted to keep the deal. But I think we were going to head to a crunch point pretty soon, and I think we're getting there right now, because if you look what's happening in Syria, you had the supreme leader of Iran's closest advisor touring the area in Syria that was gassed a few days ago, and basically showing solidarity, not with the victims, but the attackers. And I think the pressure to begin sanctioning Iran again for some of these actions is only going to grow. But I personally think if the types of sanctions that would really hurt Iran, whether it's hitting their central bank or hitting their oil exports, again, things that could really cause change, if we start going down that road, the JCPOA could blow up because this issue of sanctions was never really resolved. And I think for the third point, I thought, in my mind, why the deal was either going to implode or going to have to be renegotiated is the issue of these inspections. The deal was kind of sold. We can get anytime, anywhere access to suspect Iranian sites. I covered it very closely on the ground in Vienna. There was never a consensus on that. The Iranians, even during the negotiations, were saying they're not going to get into our military sites. The U.S. the UN got into this area called Parchin a few weeks after the agreement was reached. They actually did find some uranium, so this issue is kind of lurking back there. And the IAEA, the UN inspectors, have never really tried to go back, I think because they know that would precipitate a crisis. And so that issue is kind of lurking there. So there are all these issues. That said, what does President Trump do if he resolves or pulls out of the agreement? And I think it's a real question, because even if there had to be a renegotiation at some point, it clearly doesn't look like the Trump administration has created the diplomatic consensus of any kind with the Europeans about how this might be renegotiated. We're hearing, I'm sure Dennis is hearing too, that the Europeans are willing to give some ground on maybe some new sanctions on the missile issue, maybe some more pressure on the inspections. But this issue of the sunset clauses, the terms when the Iranians could ramp back up, hasn't been resolved, and I don't think it will be. So if they pull out, it's going to be a really, I think it's going to be a real shock to the system. My sense is what they might try to do is to start reimposing sanctions and doing it for some of the reasons I've said, like look at what they're doing in Syria. They're completely complicit in the gassing of civilians. The Iranian central bank is a part of that. Let's hit them for human rights violations or supporting terrorism and not the nuclear issue. And I think it will be very hard to find a consensus on these types of issues, which is likely what's going to play out after May 12th if President Trump does do what we think he's going to do. So I expect he will, but to getting a consensus on these issues and a way forward is going to be very bumpy in this type of environment where there's so much distrust between the U.S. and Europe, between now the U.S., Russia, and China. I think we're headed to a bit of a diplomatic vacuum that's going to be very chaotic. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, so first I was struck by the fact of Ian's introduction, because he said, you're all young professionals, and obviously the three of us are not. But let me pick up on what both of my colleagues have said, and then I'll offer an observation on what's next. I think this issue that Jim was raising about the hope for transformation as opposed to a transaction is right. I played a major role in the Iranian policy in the first term of the Obama administration. I wasn't there for the second term. And I think in the first term, as long as Ahmadinejad was there were very low expectations of what could happen. Once Rouhani got elected, it changed the sense of what was possible, because there was a perception that he really wanted to change or produce change in Iran for Iran's reasons. At the time when the JCPOA was concluded, not surprisingly, the administration really wanted me to come out and support it. Obviously, having been in the administration, having played a role on Iran, and I had a number of conditions, none of which required renegotiation of the deal. But one of the things in the conversation I had with the president, I said, look, whatever you do when you think about this, one of the reasons I think it's so important for us to get understandings with the Europeans now on imposing sanctions against Iran when they ramp up their action in the region, which they will inevitably do. I said the reason they will inevitably do that is because the supreme leader, after doing this deal, has to show he hasn't given up his ideology. Once he does a deal with the great Satan, it looks like maybe he's changed. And he's going to act very quickly to demonstrate that he hasn't. And the way he can do that is in the region. So I said we should be focused on getting a set of understandings with the Europeans now on how we'll raise the price to the Iranians once they do what I believe is going to be inevitable. Well, needless to say, we didn't do that. And of course, that's where we are now. And the irony is the Europeans, as a way of trying to keep us in the deal, are prepared to do more. And that's really the central point. One can like this president, one can dislike this president. The fact is, because he's talked about getting out of the deal, and because it seems quite plausible that he's inclined to do so, it creates a lever. The Europeans do not want us to withdraw from the deal. So they're willing not to renegotiate the deal, but they're willing to try to address the concerns that the administration has raised. And truth be told, they have moved. Not where they were before, they have moved. It's true on the issue of the sunset provisions, that's the area where there's the least given their position, because that in a sense means rewriting the deal, and they're not prepared to do that. But they are prepared to make a statement that, in a sense, talks about, expectations. Expectations about Iran not putting itself in a position where it might be moving towards a weapon, which itself would violate the terms of the deal. So they're looking for a statement that would at least signal something on the sunset provisions without, in a sense, contradicting the deal. On the ICBM testing, they're absolutely willing to do sanctions. The issue on inspections, I think they would be prepared to come up with some kind of statement on that as well, even though their own position is, look, you have the right, under the terms of the deal, to challenge any undeclared site. Just bring it to the Joint Commission. So I think they'll emphasize that, but then make a statement that means that there's no sites that by definition are off limits, including military facilities, notwithstanding what the Iranians have said. And on the region, they're actually prepared, I think, to consider what would be sanctions on Iran's behavior in the region. So the question then becomes, since they have moved from that standpoint, if the president then walks away anyway after they've negotiated in good faith, the problem is he walks away alone. And then I think it comes, then you have to ask yourself the question, okay, so what is the point of walking away? I teach at Georgetown, and one of the classes I teach is on statecraft. The essence of good statecraft is having very clear objectives that you can act on and having the means, whether on your own or that you can mobilize with others, to fulfill those objectives. So what is the objective? I mean, walking away from the JCPOA, that's a means. It's not an end in itself. If the objective is to increase the pressure on Iran, this unfortunately is not the way to do it. Because if we walk away by ourselves, then the pressure actually ends up being more on us than it is on them, number one. Number two, where they're really active is in the region. The JCPOA, I have to say, I was not a huge fan of it, precisely for the reasons that Jay was outlining, because it legitimizes a very large nuclear infrastructure in the year 2030. And it allows, starting in the year 2025, the Iranians to begin to install advanced centrifuges that are dramatically more efficient than the ones that they have now. And that will allow them to exponentially increase what their output is starting in 2030. So my conditions at the time were very much related to finding ways to increase deterrence so the Iranians down the road wouldn't even be tempted once they're in a position where their breakout time, as you were saying, Jay, is basically zero, because that's what it will be after 2030, that we don't even want them to be tempted to think that they could present the world with a nuclear weapons fait accompli. So I was focused very heavily on what can you do to raise the cost to them in the region as a way of saying, wherever you transgress, you're going to pay a price. I had also other ideas, and the Obama administration was able to restrain their enthusiasm for them. I thought that we should provide the Israelis, maybe lease the Israelis, a massive ordnance penetrator and the means to deliver it, because that's a mountain buster, not a bunker buster. One of the enrichment sites in Fordo is in a mountain. And even if we were to change our declaratory policy and to say if the Iranians violate the terms of the deal, one of which they themselves commit to not acquiring, developing, or pursuing nuclear weapons, that we would be prepared to act to take out their nuclear infrastructure. And if they doubted that we would do it, having the Israelis with the massive ordnance penetrator would send a signal that they would do it and we would back them. So the point is, what are our objectives if we walk away from the deal? Will it make it easier for us to counter them in the region? Well, probably not, because one of the things that's going to happen, the Europeans at that point will go to great lengths to try to keep the Iranians in the deal. And the Iranians know how to play on their fears. Already you have Salehi saying that, within 4 days they'll be able to enrich to 20%. I've heard others have talked about, well, they'll have 190,000 separate working units, meaning basically this means centrifuges within 2 years. And that will, understandably, alarm the Europeans that we're heading towards a conflict. So they'll, I think, offer a set of incentives to the Iranians to stay in the deal. And there are those who say, well, the Iranians won't want to, the Europeans won't want to do that because, in effect, they have to choose between doing business with us or doing business with the Iranians. And that's always, in my mind, been a nice theory. But I go back to the Clinton administration, in which the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act was adopted, and that said any European energy company doing more than $20 million worth of business with the Iranians would be subject to sanctions. Only the European governments then went ahead and adopted blocking regulations that said any company that responded to that would be in violation of laws there. So no European companies stopped doing business with the Iranians, and the Clinton administration and the Bush 43 administration did not, in fact, go ahead and impose sanctions. So is this administration going to face a Europe that is prepared to say, we're not going along with this and we'll even adopt blocking regulations? I don't know, but they need to think about that. They need to think about the day after. Right now, what you have is an impulse to walk away from the deal because the president thinks it's a terrible deal, but it's not at all clear that there's a strategy. And I would say the same thing, just to wrap this up. It's not at all clear that we have a policy on Syria. If we go ahead and we carry out some strikes, which I think at some point we will in fact do, whether it's in the next few days or in the next few weeks, we will, because in truth, one of the main things that drives the president is being not Obama. And so he has to prove he's not Obama. And so his red lines he acts on. And by the way, there's a value in doing that. Not only as it relates to Syria, you want to establish the principle that using chemical weapons is not okay. Not just for Syria, but elsewhere. Other leaders who might get in trouble and think they have a get-out-of-jail-free card by going ahead and using chemical weapons, it has to be clear you don't get to do that with impunity. The cost can be high to you. So I think the administration is right to go ahead and carry out a set of punishing strikes, but I'd also like to see it in a context. How does it fit what we would like to see in Syria? How could we use it to create leverage on the Russians so that the Russians will decide it's in their interest to do more to contain the Iranians within Syria? How does any walk away from the JCPOA fit a broader strategy towards Iran? The JCPOA, again, is an element of the policy. It's not the sum total of it. And if we haven't prepared the ground for what comes after, and that's really what you were saying, it's not, you were saying, Jay, that it's chaos. I'm worried that I can envision the following from the Iranians. The Iranians will play the victim. Say, look what the Americans did. They walked away from the deal. They'll play on European fears. The Europeans will probably look for ways to try to entice the Iranians to stay in the deal. The Iranians will play the victim at that level, but they'll try to show us there's a price. And I think where they'll try to show the price to us is in the region. I think we'll see more done in Yemen, and I think we may see more done in Iraq and even Syria again by the Shia militias against us. So I hope the administration, if it makes this decision, has thought through what comes afterwards and how the Iranians are likely to respond and how the Europeans are likely to respond, and they have an approach for that. If they do have that approach, they've kept it very well hidden.
Thank you. I want to go back, Dennis, to what you were saying about the Europeans and what they do if the administration walks away from this. I was surprised to hear Pompeo say today that these negotiations are ongoing, and he said we're close to achieving the fix the president has asked for. I think the Europeans, having at the beginning of this process been very pessimistic that it would succeed, I think they've gotten a little more optimistic despite the Bolton and the Pompeo and all of that. I mean, because they feel like they actually have, and I say this from talking to people after the meetings this week, they feel like, you know, they've got an agreement on ballistic missiles, they've got an agreement on verification, they think they can get there on the sunset clause. So if the State Department's leading these negotiations, they say they've gotten the go-ahead from the new regime in the administration to continue. If they come to an agreement and say, okay, we got everything you wanted, and we believe, the State Department, believe that this meets the president's concerns, and the Europeans, we think the Europeans have gone a long way. If the president then, which everyone agrees he may very well do, says, nope, not good enough for me, what happens then? You know, some of the Europeans have said, you know, this is it for transatlantic relations, which I don't think is true. But what does that do to these larger relationships that the United States wants to have with allies?
Look, I think you lay out. First, I think what your description is apt. We've had some of our own discussions with the Europeans, and I think they are hopeful that those that they're dealing with in the administration, that they really can reach an agreement with them. I think the hardest issue for them still is the sunset provision. But I also have the sense that there is a way that they're prepared at least to make a statement. Now, it falls short of where we are, but it's given everything else, and especially if they were to do more in the region, that it really would produce agreement below the level of the president. Mm-hmm. And I do think that I'm not one of those who thinks that Pompeo comes in and he wants to be the one to spoil all this. I don't think that as Secretary of State, the first thing he wants to see is that he's got a fundamental breach with the allies. I also think there is still some potential that things could work out. Macron is coming here, and he's, among the Europeans, I'd say he probably has the best relationship with President Trump. And he will certainly make the case that as a collective we have far more capability to put pressure on Iran than if there's a break between us, and that why would you want to do what the Iranians want, which is a break between us and the Europeans. So he'll make that case, and that may yet produce an outcome, or it could produce another, well, we'll give this more time. Now that's, I think, the more hopeful scenario. You're asking a question about the less hopeful one. I do think, that the Europeans will basically, more in sorrow than in anger, will say that they will not go along with the United States. They will not follow what the U.S. is doing in terms of sanctions. That they'll try to continue to talk to the United States about, just because the president says he's no longer going to waive the sanctions doesn't necessarily mean that there's an active imposition. You can always have a declared policy, but the declared policy doesn't necessarily produce immediate steps that you have to act on. And here again, the administration could decide, and maybe this is where Pompeo, not wanting to have a fundamental breach with the Allies, maybe he could prevail upon the president to go slow in terms of any kind of implementation, to continue to look for ways to try to affect Iranian behavior. I guess the concern I have is that you can finesse this for a little while, but I think it's going to be harder and harder for this president to say that he's not acting on what he said he was going to do.
Well, couldn't he say, I demanded that we fix this thing, and we've, gone some distance to doing that, and therefore
but that's not
it's a victory for me.
But that wasn't the core of your question. The core of your question was, he walks away, what are the consequences? Right. Look, I've said the key to this is being able to go to Trump and saying, you won.
Right.
This is a great win. You achieved what Obama couldn't achieve. And he can come out and he can say that. And that should be the strategy of both the Europeans and people within the administration, that the truth is the Europeans are adopting positions that are different than they had before. And that is a function of the threat of walking away. So there was leverage created. The point is, when you have leverage, actually use it for a purpose. The real question is, will the administration be prepared to accept what are moves by the Europeans that are not everything that we want, accepting that this is better than the alternative of walking away and walking away alone. And I think that's the real problem with walking away alone, is we end up isolating the U.S. and not the Iranians. This is a good time to maintain and actually build pressure on Iran, precisely because what's going on within Iran right now, the devaluation of the rial, is creating real pressures on the leadership. You have a level of competition in the elite right now that is pretty striking between those who, basically the Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Forces Soleimani, who want to press for greater confrontation because isolation from their standpoint is good. It deepens the sense of ideological fervor at a time when few seem to embrace it. It justifies the internal controls within the country. It gives them more control within the economy itself. It's clear they have that kind of a posture. And they think that they're being successful in the region. Rouhani obviously comes at it from a different standpoint. And there are signs that Khamenei is more concerned about the level of alienation within the country. So this is actually a time to try to play on the contradictions, not in a sense to relieve them of the contradictions.
Jay, you've written a good bit about the Iranian economy. And if you look at the problems it's having now and assume that the deal, that the Americans walk out of the deal, that, as you said, the Europeans would try to offer some incentives for them to stay. What could that be? I mean, will the Europeans be in a position to actually allow them to keep the economy from collapsing? Are there things that they can do, or would the American banks essentially make it so hard for them, despite whatever measures they might try to take to get around it, that it simply won't be possible to continue in a way that allows the Iranians to tell their own people that it's still worth their while?
Right. I mean, one of the interesting things about covering the kind of the beginning of the financial war against Iran starting in 2006, if you go back then, the Europeans were pretty hesitant. And I do think Obama, when he came in, he did a good job of sort of saying, look, I'm trying with these people, but they're not interested, so let's sanction them. But I still think, at the end of the day, the power of the dollar, the power of the U.S. economy is such that even if Trump totally ham-fists this thing and the European governments are really angry, I think it's still really hard for European companies and banks to sort of say, well, I'm going to take the risk that they're going to start saying yes, and I'm going to go in to an economy that's in free fall. I mean, most companies don't want to go invest in a country whose currency is depreciated by 50% or whatever in the last year. So I think it would be interesting, because I, in reporting on this earlier, found that diplomacy definitely played a role, but I think at the end of the day, it was billions in dollars of fines against European banks by the New York authorities, by the US, by the Treasury, that really spooked them to the point they're still not going back. So it's good if he pulls out and this tension remains. I still think you're not going to see some windfall of European companies sort of giving us the finger and going in there. A, because they need dollar access, and we still are the biggest economy in the world, and B, it's just such. I never really bought into the Iranian line that the Americans haven't encouraged enough for money to go back, because they did absolutely nothing to reform their economy, and I think there was a huge hole in it. The kind of the wild card for me in all this is that there is a lot of unrest there, and it feels like their economy is really on the brink. Does Pompeo or Bolton say let's sanction the central bank of Iran? Let's just cause as much instability as possible and see what happens. I'm not saying that's the right course, but I do wonder if that's factoring in, because just the perception of new sanctions has caused these runs in the last couple months that are pretty. It's a big shock to a system to have an economy, to see your currency fall that much.
So we've talked about how, not really knowing if the administration is planning kind of for the day after, but what are the Iranians doing to plan for the day after? I mean, do they have a plan? Or is it just beyond their control? There's not anything they can do.
I think what Dennis was saying, some of it is you do hear Salehi saying, "Oh, we can start enriching to 20%." My sense is on the economic side, they've tried to take measures, arresting currency speculators, putting more capital controls, but I think the problem for them is what these protesters want and what causes instability are reforms that they can't deliver on. And how does the West kind of exploit that? Is it by trying to basically cause an economic collapse, or is it what Dennis was saying, is kind of try to support moderates inside that system somehow, even though I know there's a lot of skepticism, even amongst the Iranian population now, that Rouhani really was going to deliver anything much different than his predecessors. And that's why you still see these kind of rolling protests, even if they weren't as pronounced as they were in December. They're still going on. And that to me is kind of the wild card in this room, where you have this regional conflict where the Iranians are probing the Israelis inside, using drones to go into the Israeli airspace. The Houthis are shooting missiles into Saudi and seem to be using them as almost to probe the Saudi air defenses. Is the only way to really counter the Iranians in the region is to try to hit them where they're most weak now, which is at home, I think.
Jim, you were talking about how when the Iran deal was negotiated, there was all kinds of criticism, as there is now from the Trump administration, that it didn't deal with all these other issues that we have with Iran, the support for terrorism, the proliferation activities, human rights concerns at home. The Obama administration's answer to that was always, we're going to deal with those later, and now this is all about nukes, and we should get this done. And in fact, if we can get a deal with the Iranians, it'll make it easier, perhaps, to address some of these other issues. But I don't see how the Trump administration has really, they haven't put the screws really to Iran with things that they could have done outside of the agreement. They've made some attempts at the UN. They've had some sanctions related to missiles, but they really haven't used what they could have used, certainly not in Syria, to make life tough for Iran.
Bingo. I think Dennis touched on that. And this is a fascinating point. Certainly, many of us have contacts with our Israeli colleagues who, I think, and Dennis knows them better than I, but basically to a man and women are saying, we're disappointed in what you were doing against Iran. This is an existential. First time I heard this was at a Belfer Center forum with the Israelis back in December. An existential issue for us, and we all know what they're talking about with that. And the problem is, as these missiles and rockets get more accurate, and there are only so many electrical generation stations and refineries and airports and military bases and airfields that you can launch strike aircraft from in Israel. The one thing, you know what the one military thing is you can't do with a Hezbollah rocket or missile? You can't hit a submarine. Think of the implications of that. We are facing a very dangerous situation, and the drone was an example of it. The missiles landing on the Saudi airport, another, and everything going on in Syria, including the perhaps sarin or nerve gas attack the other day. And this administration has done very little about it. And my fear is, and this sounds to be anti-Trump, but it's basically anti our way of doing foreign policy. So as you're here to learn, engage, and know, I'll throw out a tidbit of wisdom as I see it, and that is real foreign policy successes, and the JCPOA is one of them, as was Bush's surge, is when you roll the dice, engage totally as the president, take on whoever the hell you have to take on, the international community, your own Congress, your own public, for a compromise win-win solution. That's what Bush did in the first Gulf War. We didn't go, thank God, to Baghdad, and 12 years later we realized why that was a good idea not to go to Baghdad. We did 500,000 troops and 500,000 other troops in order just to liberate Kuwait, status quo ante. Those kind of things actually work, not these miracle cures. I'm afraid that this president doesn't want to do the hard, risky work, building alliances in Congress or with the American people or with our allies to do the very hard and very risky work, because we've had a lot of experience with, and I've had personal experience with the Iranians. When you screw with them, they come back at you. They hit you hard. I don't think he wants to do that, and it's so much easier just to issue another tweet saying he won't do the JCPOA waivers anymore, and well, take that, Iran. You're toast.
Do you think he's sort of getting played by the Saudis and the Israelis and the whole sort of constant drumbeat of, yes, Iran's the enemy, Iran's the enemy, Iran's the enemy?
Yeah, well, as they fired a rocket into my house in 2011, I'm a bad person to give you an objective view of that, nor after I found out that they actually did try to blow up the Cafe Milano, should I think Washingtonians should be particularly sympathetic to them. I think they are the enemy. I think, of course, these people are spinning us. Every ally in a collective security system wants to do maximum security benefits from us with minimum contribution to the system. That's the nature. That's in part of our tradecraft as the little midgets in the woodwork. That's certainly what I would describe my role is to grease the system and tweak the system to make sure they don't get away with that. But of course they're going to try it, and we don't hold it against them. We just push back. No, because the alternative, if you go down that way of thinking, you know where you arrive? You arrive at Barack Obama in his Goldberg interview in The Atlantic, which is Saudi Arabia needs to share the region with Iran. It's real simple, and the older I get, the more I get to simple solutions. I rack and stack the entire world into two kinds of countries: those who like the status quo and want the American security system to be around, and those who don't like the status quo and want to get rid of it. The latter are enemies, the former are friends. Friends can be really misbehaving. Enemies can, let women drive and run around Tehran with only half-scarves on and actually have a pretty good economy in the old days, but they're still the enemy. And friends, however bad they are, and look at our list, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt, they're still our friends.
Can I just pick up on
that? Yeah.
I don't think if they're trying to play us, they're not succeeding. Because the whole point of your question was the rhetoric of the administration on Iran is tough, but the practical behavior is not.
Even bombing, with the Syrian thing, that's not going to hurt Iran. I mean,
no, it's not. But my point is, the Iranians actually are doing things. I've been up in the Golan Heights and I saw a forward position of the Quds force with Hezbollah 3.5 miles away. Why are they there? Why are they there? This is not a defensive move. This is part of an effort to create a northern front against the Israelis. And the Israelis are basically saying, here's a threat that's coming. Bibi has made 7 trips to see Putin. He's had 2 objectives in those. One is deconfliction, which has worked, and the other is containment of the Iranians, which has not. The Russians aren't containing the Iranians, and clearly we're not acting to contain them because we've made it very clear. When it comes to Syria, it's ISIS. And the issue of the chemical weapons, it's pretty clear at this point, if we do something, it's about dealing with the chemical weapons, it's not about dealing with Assad. The hope is this will deter him from doing more and it'll have an effect outside of Syria.
Right.
But it's not about somehow limiting or containing what the Iranians do there. And what the problem that we face is that the Iranians are moving in a direction not just to entrench themselves, but increasingly they pose a threat to the Israelis that Jim was starting to touch on. If you're Israel and you face 120,000 rockets that Hezbollah has in Lebanon, those rockets are bad enough, but you think you can handle them unless they actually get advanced guidance systems for them. In which case, you're a small country with a very limited number of high-value strategic targets, militarily and economically. When Israel says they can't live with that, they actually can't live with that. The problem is we should recognize this isn't Israel playing us. This is heading towards a collision, a war that you know how it starts, but you don't know where it ends. And this, another, Jim's.
It was too subtle, perhaps, the submarine.
I was going to say your cryptic reference. That's the way to submarines was. One thing I know about the Israelis, they won't allow themselves to be in a situation where the Iranians think they've created, which is an asymmetrical reality where they can threaten Israel from Syria and Lebanon, but Israel can't threaten them. Well, the Israeli DNA doesn't work that way. And if, in fact, the Israelis start taking 1,000 rockets a day from Hezbollah and they read the Iranians thinking they can orchestrate this threat, there'll come a point where the Israelis will do something against the Iranians. And if they hit certain kinds of high-value targets for the Iranians, then you see a very large potential for escalation, but you don't see a clear effort for how to stop it. Now, we shouldn't want that to take place for our own reasons. If for no other reason than a war that expands that way could very easily begin to hit oil facilities. And for all the talk of our independence, yeah, we're going to be the largest oil-producing country in the world, but there's still only one pool of oil. So you create a major disruption in the Middle East, you're going to bid the price up very dramatically. So the point is, we do have a stake, and we don't really have an interest in a war erupting there. And the longer we stay sort of sitting on the sidelines, the greater the risk that that's going to take place. And that's not the Israelis playing us, because as I said, if they were successful, we would have already done something.
Jay, do you want to jump in on that?
As far as I know, there's been in recent years like skepticism that are the Iranians as big a threat as we think, or the Syrians as big a threat as we think, or the North Koreans as big a threat as they think. And as a journalist, you do always try to be kind of skeptical, but it's like I just like some of the stuff that's come to I mean, this isn't Iran specific, but some of the stuff the North Koreans are doing in Syria, I never believed was true. Yeah. And the UN puts out a report a few weeks ago. They're building a huge chemical weapons facility, and North Korean advisors are deployed at bases inside Syria to essentially help them with missiles. So I don't know. I think in a lot of ways this kind of axis of resistance of the Syrians and the Iranians and the North Koreans and the Russians and the Chinese in some ways is crystallizing in ways that is worse than I imagined or anticipated, just because the capabilities they have, the potential that the North Koreans have shared everything they have with the Syrians. And it's inconceivable to me they wouldn't do the same with the Iranians, given these relationships that go back so long.
Well, I want to open the floor for questions, but let me just ask finally where the Russians are on all of this. If we really started to crack down on the Iranians, inside or outside of the deal, where are the Russians in that?
Well, let's take a look at Putin. What's the most important thing to Putin? It's to show that he is the arbiter of events.
Right.
I think one of the things that
he's done a pretty good job of it in Syria.
Yeah.
No, look, I mean, you can't. When Bibi takes 7 trips there, when for the first time ever a king of Saudi Arabia goes to Moscow, when
with
the
his
king,
own golden staircase.
when the king of Jordan, right after this administration, which isn't necessarily enamored with foreign assistance, actually does a 5-year deal with Jordan. The first thing he does after concluding the deal goes to Moscow. Putin has pretty well positioned himself as an arbiter. Now the question is, does he want the price to go up? At this point, he's achieved what he wants. He has an air base in Syria, which even the Soviets didn't have. He has a naval facility, which he's turning into a full-fledged naval base, which even the Soviets didn't have. For a guy who is a major part of his legitimacy in Russia is that he's restored a sense of strong identity. He's created a sense that Russia matters on the world stage. He's showing that that in some ways they're much more of a central player than the United States in the Middle East. This is all successful, and he's done it at a low cost. So the question is whether the cost is going to remain low. One of the things that we ought to be doing is, in a sense, saying, right, you may well be in the middle of all this, and we, in the end, aren't going to tolerate a war that erupts and that can expand. And even if we don't want to be there, we could be sucked back into it in a way that you're not going to want to see. Putin doesn't want to see us using military power to affect the course of events. If we want to influence Putin, then we have to play upon what it is that he doesn't want to see. Now, look, he's transactional, and that means you can create pressures on him. It also means there are things that could be inducements to him. We have to think about how you affect the Putin calculus. So far, our whole approach in Syria has been shaped by a presumption that somehow Putin really had differences with Assad, and he really had differences with the Iranians. And I've said for the last 6 years that if he has differences, he's really disguised them really well, and his behaviors belie that he has differences.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, 2 things. The theory that some of us at least see is Putin loves the 19th century, like Erdogan. That is a handful of great powers negotiate with each other, fight each other, ally with each other, and the rest of the world kind of, takes the crumbs that are offered them in terms of their territory, their borders, their populations, their riches. And that's about the best he can hope for in the Middle East. He's operating in Syria, as you said brilliantly, with the 4th largest air force operating in Syria. The Turks, the Israelis, and the coalition, as we call ourselves, are all bigger. The Iranians, and his goal is to replace the U.S. post-1973 regional collective security U.S.-led system with this 19th century thing, which he's very good at playing. The Iranians want to replace that system with a variant of an Iranian hegemony in the region. So that is the difference, the delta between where he is and they are, because if they succeed, he starts finding himself being squeezed out. And the people who really know Syria can point out various ways where the Iranians and the Syrians on one hand and the Russians on the other are at loggerheads on things. But as Dennis said, we don't see, my wedge theory doesn't seem to be playing, partially because we're not putting a whole lot of cost on them. But there's 2 other reasons. One is, and my experience with Putin was only 1 hour once in 2006, but it was 2007. But it was an hour-long harangue of George W. Bush, who's not an easy guy to harangue, by Putin on all the things America has done wrong and all of his grievances and gripes and everything and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It was like a machine gun of bitches and moans and other things. This guy really wants to do bad things to us, and I take it from his 1989 experience in Leipzig, perhaps. The second thing is, it's impossible for me to believe that Putin or the Russians wanted the Iranians to launch this, huge drone to get shot down over Israeli territory by Israel 2 days after the Wagner boys and their Syrian friends got whacked by the United States, as Dennis said, in a particularly colorful demonstration of American firepower. Nor do I think after he basically got the Eastern Ghouta victory and a negotiated retreat up to Turkland and Idlib, he wanted the Syrians to apparently use nerve or sarin gas and bring this whole thing on with Trump. Yet he has to face this because it's very hard, as we know, controlling your allies in the field. They kind of wind up dictating the agenda, and he's dealing with in Assad and with Qasem Soleimani, people who are just as tough, just as determined as he is, and he's kind of saddled with them, just as we've found ourselves so many times saddled with our local allies, and it often hasn't turned out well.
Jim, I agree with all that. There is something very interesting, though, once again showing that at this point he's not prepared to change direction. The Russians are the ones who outed the Israelis on this attack.
Mm-hmm.
Now, by going ahead and outing him, when the Israelis still haven't admitted anything, he put the Iranians in a position where they have to retaliate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you wouldn't normally think that that's in Russian interest to do that, but they did it. And I think part of it was to sort of signal the Israelis, okay, you hit a base that's too close to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore you might have to pay a price from the Iranians. But it also means, once again, that this guy, for all the what seemingly are the rational reasons why he shouldn't want to be doing this, he shouldn't want Assad to be doing what he's doing, nonetheless, every posture at this point still seems to be one that lines up with the Syrians and the Iranians. And I don't see it changing soon, because there will be at least a low-level insurgency for some time to come, and his boots on the ground are the Shia militias. So I don't see this separation. I think over time he has an interest, but at this point I don't see a change. And as I said, by outing the Israelis, he actually did something that creates an escalatory potential, that if he really didn't have that interest, they shouldn't have done this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's go to questions. Is there a microphone? Or is this, we can hear it.
Yeah, if you guys just raise your hand, question, and I'll come bring the mic to you.
Do you want people to say who they are? Is that...
Yeah, say who you are and where you're from, like what.
Hi, I'm Dave Curtis. I work with Portland Communications just down the street. Thanks for the panel. I was just wondering, back to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. When it was first announced, there was sort of this huge lobbying push to kill the deal, and it was very close in the end, on the voting in the Senate and all of that. And our European allies, you guys touched on this a lot, was, our European allies completely support the deal. They always come out and say how important it is to stay with the deal and all of this stuff. I'm just wondering what the reasons are behind, it seems like the U.S. is the only country that has sort of an actual, there's an entire party behind the anti-Iran deal. There's not really any significant parties or movements, I don't think, in Europe to try and kill the deal. Are our European colleagues basically being deluded by this? Are their allies being deluded by Iran and by Russia and by China? What makes us understand the deal so much more than them? Are they willing to give Iran, a nuclear weapon because they want, their economies to go into Iran and, exploit the Iranian economy? And that's basically my question, just because I think a lot of the younger Americans, is it because our special relationship with Israel? Is it because Iran, animosity between Iran and the U.S.? Because, we don't remember 1979. We don't really care about that stuff as much anymore, at least a lot of younger people.
I found it interesting during the negotiations that the French, for a good part of the negotiations, were more hawkish than the Obama administration. I think there is a couple of reasons. One, they're pretty hardline on the issue of nuclear proliferation. Traditionally, I always found it interesting dealing with French diplomats, because a lot of them had actually spent time in Tehran, and I found them to be the most hawkish because they'd actually dealt with these guys and didn't really trust them. But at some point, once the deal was signed, I think the French gave up more business than anyone, I think, as part of the sanctions. They gave up a lot more than we did. We gave up basically nothing, and the Germans gave up a lot. But once the kind of the ink was set, they seemed to just kind of flip, and the business interest and got involved. And I think, yeah, they just have a much bigger, in my estimation, they had a much bigger business lobby in those countries because they've had much more commerce there. And I think the issue of Israel is not as, it's the pro-Israel community there isn't as large. So to me, it was those two factors which were the difference. But it wasn't the case throughout the process that the U.S. was much more kind of concerned or hawkish. The French were, which was interesting to me.
I would add one point. The one point I would add is they really fear that the alternative to the deal was war. And the last thing they wanted to see was a war with the Iranians. I think that was kind of the overriding concern. And one of the reasons, even it's true, I mean, the French, while I was still in the Obama administration and afterwards, I would still see them, they would literally come to me and complain about why does the administration have such a soft position on these things? They were prepared to be much tougher, but once the deal was done, the deal was done. Yeah.
If I was hoping this question would come up. In fact, I was about to answer your question when Karen answered it, Dennis, by bringing in the Europeans, because despite my tenure here at the Middle East, the Washington Institute for Middle East Policy, I've spent much of my career in Europe, particularly in Germany. And commercial interests are very important for all of these countries. But you have to understand that for a critical mass of Europeans, including the European Union foreign policy worldview, which is bureaucrats, leaders like Mogherini, think tanks that are associated with them and such, and Germany, something like the JCPOA is their secular religion. They think this is the alternative to our dirty, because it involves killing people, global collective security order. As individual states, France and Britain are quite capable of partying with us in Iraq or in the first Gulf War, in West Africa and such, because they still are players on the international stage. Europe as a whole, in that mass in the middle of Europe, Germany, which dictates a lot of how Europe thinks collectively, combined with the EU, cannot recognize the role of force in international affairs. And because we, I won't quite say embrace it, despite the parade we'll be having up Pennsylvania Avenue, because we use it, because they know they never can. France can and Britain can to the extent they deploy military forces, but it's no accident that the German contribution to the war against ISIS, you know, the guys who burn people alive in cages, is 6 photograph airplanes. So they take pictures of ISIS so that we, the British and the French, can then kill them. This is the mindset. This is a wrong mindset, but it is very deeply held by many European populations, and as I said, 2 very important centers of collective European thinking, Germany and the EU. Therefore, us trashing this thing and the ideas behind this, that the solution to any conflict among countries is negotiation and building trust and being friends and then doing some trade deals, and as I read at the beginning, you know, welcoming the other country into the community of responsible stakeholders in the global, you know, economy, because it's so nice around Stuttgart with the Porsche and Mercedes-Benz factories and Silicon Valley. Doesn't everybody want to live like that? Barack Obama, somewhat uniquely, to some degree, I thought like these people, and believe me, he's extremely popular in Germany. The problem is that's not how the world works, at least not as I saw it. It's not how the world works as the French see it. It's not how the world works as the British see it. But as long as they are required, and that's the weird rules of the JCPOA and the P5+1 or the EU 3+EU, they had to kind of work as a team, and that puts the bias on this secular religion, this doctrine of European alternative foreign policy, and it's very hard to shake them from that, particularly when it's combined with, as Jay said, commercial interests.
I'm going to be the devil's advocate for this just a little bit. I think it's, yes, it's true that they have commercial interests, particularly the French and to some extent the Germans. Yes, it's true that they despite the fact that the French, no question, they were the toughest negotiator. I mean, how many days did we sit in the lobby of the Geneva Intercontinental waiting for the French foreign minister to come downstairs and tell us how the Americans were being too soft? You know, I think all of that is true, but I also think that there are some of them, at least in the governments of Europe, who actually believe that this was a deal that was very hard negotiation that was agreed, and that there is some merit in keeping it. And they've been taken aback by Trump's from the beginning saying, worst deal ever, when you know pretty much for a fact that he didn't, at that point at least, have a clue what was actually in the deal, or didn't really care. And so I think that they have every reason to think, aside from what all their other interests are, and that I think those are all absolutely true, that are not particularly altruistic, but you know, there is something to be said for, you negotiated this deal over several years, you signed it, it's not being violated. There are ways to achieve your ends in other ways, and it is true that the pressure from the administration has moved them and has gotten them to be much tougher, or at least to promise to be much tougher on a lot of these things. So I think you have to weigh that into.
Yeah. Well, they definitely think it's a good deal. They do, but they really want to keep it.
But Karen, I think it's a good deal too. I wasn't trying to attack the Europeans because they are, you know, they're embracing something, and I'm as horrified as they are at how this guy goes about, you know, pulling the threads out of this thing. I think we're heading for a real disaster. What I'm trying to explain is why there is nobody in Europe who doesn't think this is a really great deal, because there's an ideological thing to that. There's nobody in the Middle East. Some people hope we stay with it, for example, most Israelis, but nobody thinks we should stay with it because this deal is how you really should do foreign policy.
I mean, the one part of it, I don't even know what the answer is, but do you think there was always an assessment, and I've heard different things, that it would have to get renegotiated at some point? Like, I just don't see in 10 years, if Iran is not changed and they've mastered ballistic missiles, the world's going to accept them having all these centrifuges.
There was a segment of the Obama administration that actually believed exactly what you said. We heard it the other night, right? Mm-hmm. But there was another segment that was convinced that this was going to change Iran. You know, Rouhani represented this, you know, enlightened view, and that all we had to do was integrate them into the international financial system. It would build their stake in living up to it. They wouldn't want to absorb the costs of defecting from it. And there was a genuine sense that this would transform things. But there were some who were much more realistic and who felt, look, if we get down the road and Iran hasn't changed at all, and we're looking, you know, we're looking at them having a kind of breakout capability, we're going to have to do something. And that was, but their argument even now would be, okay,
build some.
Why? But why don't
now?
you? Yeah. Why do you create this problem now?
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah. Yep.
Hi.
Next.
Thanks for your time. My name's Zach, and I work at the State Department. I'm wondering if you could comment on the Iraq dimension here, because May 12th are Iraqi parliamentary elections. I'd just like to know your thoughts about how this, the new personnel in the administration and their records on Iran, as well as just the prospect of an American withdrawal from the JCPOA, how you see that playing out in Baghdad.
That's a good question. It gets to the argument that I was just making with the Europeans. The rest of the world has a very cold-blooded attitude towards this. They don't want to see another crisis on top of all the other crises, and they certainly don't want to see Iran with nuclear weapons, including Iraq, including, for that matter, Lebanon. But they got a lot of other problems. In a vague sort of way, to the extent the U.S. has a counter-Iran strategy in the Middle East, part of it is maintaining the best possible relationship with Iraq, which is why we have embraced Abadi, which is why we didn't support the Kurds in their breakout back in September, which is why we organized the $15 or $30 billion Reconstruction Donors Conference in Kuwait while contributing almost no money ourselves. But we've contributed a hell of a lot of money to the actual emergency relief, and we were very important player in the IMF, $15 billion. So we're actually doing a fair amount. The problem is what we fear, or at least I fear, and some in the administration fear, is that Iran will do to Iraq what it did to Lebanon. Work through groups who feel more loyal to Tehran than they do to their own state to undercut national sovereignty, create, which is very important, basically explode the monopoly of force that a state is supposed to have by creating a separate military force that, again, is answerable to Iran, and then control that country's foreign policy to the degree that Iran can use that country for what it wants and ensure nobody else, both denial and power projection, the two sides of the coin. And most troubling to me, having worked a lot on the internal, is subvert the country's political system to the extent you have to ensure these other things. In the case of Lebanon, we watched the transition from Hezbollah, which didn't participate in politics. They left that to Amal as the Shia representative. Then they did participate in politics. Then in 2008, they decided to turn their guns on their Lebanese citizen brethren, so to speak, for the first time. And now they basically dominate coalition building, which leads to the usual, in terms of tactics, absurd, but in terms of the bigger picture, somewhat understandable reaction of the Saudi Crown Prince, hijacking Prime Minister Hariri. But it didn't work because, like most of these Saudi gambits, they're not well thought out or professional or anything else. But I mean, this is a frustration. We're afraid that the same thing will happen in Iraq. The things we have going for us is, first of all, there is a competing religious center in Najaf, in the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, that is very interested in not being overrun by the Iranians. You have the whole Sadr movement, and that's one of the big names in Iraqi and actually Arab Shia Islam, the Sadr family. While he doesn't like us, he doesn't like the Iranians either. You do have the Kurds, albeit weakened. You have the Sunni Arabs, and some of the Shia parties are also very reluctant to embrace Iran. So there's some wiggle room for the United States. But the risk is that once the elections are over, the government formation will begin with a platform of the American troops will leave. And while that's more symbolic than, do they have to really be there, that will be the litmus test of whether these guys are going down the road of Lebanon. And that opens the door to all kinds of problems. This is a country that's, on a good day, if you turned the Kirkuk fields on, would be pumping 5 million barrels of oil. That's half of Saudi Arabia. From the standpoint of water, population, everything else, it's a hell of a lot more important than Syria.
Question here.
So what is Turkey's view of us getting out of the deal or staying in the deal? Are they super invested in us staying? Do they not really care? Would they maybe benefit from combating like Iran in terms of like regional rivalries or Syria policy?
That's a good question. I didn't thought about that.
The Turks were very involved in trying to, as Dennis and I know, either as our stocking husks are in competition with us, get involved in the deal that was where we were going to ship the 20% in 2009, 2010 and such. They also are very involved in the Nato program to intercept Iranian missiles. This is typical Turkish. They love the 19th century, okay, but they don't really focus on that because they have their hands full with 3 separate security problems to their south: the Russian-Iranian Assad coalition, the PKK in its various names, some of which we've renamed them, and whatever is left of ISIS or the next Sunni extremist terrorist movement that comes. And so I think basically, like most countries that are evolved, so to speak, pacta sunt servanda, which is a Latin term for, once you've got an agreement, you want to adhere to it. And that gets back to your point, Karen, I should have emphasized. That's something that does irritate all Europeans and should. There is the idea that once you have an agreement under international law, you can change it, you can abrogate it, you can do things to it, but you're supposed to do it with a certain sense of seriousness and gravitas, because these are the things that make life predictable, like our own domestic laws, and we see how important they are right now. So the Europeans in particular, and even the Turks, get nervous when somebody says, okay, that's out the window. We're just going to get rid of it because I don't like it. Worst thing ever done. And this just grates on them. On the other hand, Erdogan and Trump actually have a pretty good relationship. They seem to have a lot in common.
Anybody else want to tackle that one?
The only thing I would add is it's what Jim was touching on. Erdogan likes to be someone who also is seen as shaping events. So they tried in 2009 to do a deal with Turkey and Brazil. Came in and proposed a deal which they said was what we'd asked for, but actually would have been extremely favorable to the Iranians in the sense that Iran would be entitled to enrich. Iran still owned the material that might be housed in Turkey, and they could call it back at any point. And we rejected it, and they didn't much like that. So I have a suspicion that for reasons that relate to their own pride, they feel that even though they didn't produce the JCPOA, that it grew out of the work that they did. So from that standpoint alone, they probably would not like to see us walk away from it.
That's a good assessment.
And they did run one of the largest money laundering operations into
that's true.
Iran that's just been playing out in the U.S.
Right.
Manhattan District Court. So they were playing all sides.
Yeah. Other questions?
Thank you. My name is Ben Larna. I'm from the Iraq Foundation. Kind of going back to Syria for a second, we saw the other day with Israel's kind of deterrent strike against select Revolutionary Guard Corps targets in Syria. Do you see the U.S. combined with Britain and France, if they do so, kind of try to kill two birds with one stone if they say they're going in after these chemical weapons and try to strike the Revolutionary Guard as well to kind of deter that presence as we approach the next few years, and whether that's strikes tonight or this week, or more of a policy, a conjoined something to tamp down on this, and what can they do that's deterrent, efficient, avoiding the ready Russian defenses and whatnot, and different from the last 59 Tomahawk strike that wasn't followed up by policy and then led to more chemical weapons abuses. So do you have any predictions on that realm? Thank you. I'm dubious that that's what we'll do. I think our military has concerns about what would happen to the 2,000 people we have on the ground in Syria and roughly 5,000 we might have in Iraq. I think they're worried about if they hit Iranian targets, that invites attacks against our forces. So I don't think that's what they have in mind. I think that whatever the strikes will be, I think they'll be more geared towards trying to affect the Assad's ability to use the forces he has to conduct certain kinds of operations, at least with chemical weapons. And they have to do more than they did a year ago, because obviously it didn't work. So there'll be they want to create a sense that they're imposing a price on Assad that he really won't want to see us impose again, and that will create a set of concerns. I don't see us targeting where the Quds forces are. I just don't. I think that seems to be kind of a bridge too far in terms of the military's concerns.
We've only got 3 or 4 more minutes, so let's do a kind of lightning round of questions, and then we'll get quick answers. Yes, sir.
Where's Russia's endgame? I mean, Putin is a smart guy. I mean, he's an evil guy, but he's a smart
That's
guy.
not a short question.
Lightning round.
Where does he doesn't want a strong, powerful nuclear armed Iran. So where's Russia's end game in this game that they're playing? Are they just the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Where are they going with this?
Let's get.
The answer is yes.
Did you have a question, sir?
No, seriously, that they want us out and the Iranians want us out. And once that's achieved, then they go back to where their interests might diverge.
My question is about the recent chemical attack. Since the start of the conflict, there has been close to 200 attacks. What makes this one so special that the international community is willing to act?
Thank you, social media.
Yes.
Yeah.
And sarin.
Well, if it's if
the type of agent too, I think.
Sarin or mustard gas or nerve gas, we don't know which. If it is, frankly, what I was told today by people who should know is we don't know yet.
Yeah, but I think it's the pictures.
Exactly.
It's when you send out, and again, that's I think why people think it's some kind of nerve agent, maybe mixed with chlorine, because there have been lots of pictures of people from chlorine attacks, which admittedly killed or didn't kill as many people.
Right.
But now you have pictures of babies piled up.
Right.
I'm answering for you guys.
No, I agree.
That's okay.
That's exactly what it is.
Right. One more question? Yes.
So even at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. had a diplomatic presence in the USSR. Is there any chance in your lifetime or in my lifetime that we would reestablish diplomatic relations with Iran?
I don't think they want it. I mean, my sense I think Kerry would have flown to Tehran at a minute. Obama wanted to meet Rouhani and couldn't get him. And even under the Bush administration, they did try to open a counselors section in
the Swiss embassy.
Yeah, and I think the last thing the supreme leader wants is Americans running around Tehran, because I think we would have opened anything if under the last 8 years if they would have done it. But he's not going to be around much longer. So.
The supreme leader fears a cultural invasion more than he fears anything else. So an American presence is the worst thing for him.
I'd welcome it, and actually tried at one point to open a negotiation with the Iranians, but only if we're kicking them in the teeth, because that's what we were doing to the Soviets during the Cold War with Berlin and the Korean War and all those other things. Everybody knew what our position was and what we would do to defend it, and therefore talking with them was a way to lubricate the relations you needed. Nobody knows where we are on anything, beginning with Iran. I think that's one takeaway from tonight. And therefore, we would confuse things even more, including among our friends and allies who feel threatened by Iran, by doing something like that.
You couldn't do it behind the backs of our friends now. That was the big mistake of the Obama administration's secret channel was kept from the Israelis and the Saudis. In the Israeli case, they knew about it, and it added to their fundamental sense of betrayal. And it made their attitude towards the deal that much more negative because they weren't brought in. Had they been brought in, I'm not saying it would have been 180-degree different, but it would have been significantly different.
So we've run out of time, and I'm going to ask each of you, if you had to bet today on the JCPOA, stay or go, what's going to happen?
A week ago, I would have said, Karen, definitely go, and that's what not just my own feeling, that's what I was hearing from people who, again, should know. This whole chemical weapons thing and the fact that the French and the British seem to be possibly willing to use force with us, that's a game changer, I think, possibly in Trump's mind, because whatever he's got to do with this chemical weapons thing is now more important than the JCPOA. So let's just see.
My gut still says he gets rid of it, but I agree this chemical weapon thing could change the discourse.
55-45 he stays.
That's interesting. I was hearing
because Dennis had an op-ed in the Washington Post.
It was 60-40. It was 60-40 go. That was, maybe 3 weeks ago.
Where are you?
I'm a journalist. I don't have an opinion. Thank you all. Thanks to our panel. You guys were great.